After I signed the papers, my own daughter told me I was only a guest in the house, and the land I built with my late husband no longer belonged to me. I walked out that night with nothing but the sound of her laughter behind me. My chest ached with a pain heavier than age, heavier than loss. I thought I had already buried the hardest parts of my life, but this betrayal cut deeper. What they did not know was that I still had one final move left, and it would change everything. The wine hadn't even been poured yet when Vanessa stood up and turned my life into a public humiliation. It was supposed to be a private celebration. Just family and a few close friends gathered under the pergola behind the vineyard. I had arranged everything: cheese trays, fresh flowers, even a bottle of reserve Cabernet I had set aside for years. They didn't know the occasion. I wanted to surprise them. My voice had been rehearsing the words all day, that I was stepping back from daily operations, and that the vineyard would transition into a family trust. I thought it would be a moment of pride. Instead, Vanessa raised her glass before I had a chance to speak. "We are beyond blessed," she said, her voice sugary and confident. "As of this morning, the vineyard and the Carmel Beach House now belong to Ethan and me. My mother has generously transferred the deeds, and we're so honored to carry on the family legacy." There was clapping. I remember the sound of it. Polite, uncertain. Someone gave a half laugh. I felt every eye turn to me. But I hadn't said those words. I hadn't agreed to that. Vanessa smiled at me like it was all part of the plan. My lips parted, but the room spun before I could form a sentence. Ethan stepped beside her and placed a manila folder on the table. "The paperwork is already signed," he said calmly. "All official. You just forgot to tell everyone." I looked down. My name was on the signature line. The trust documents, the ones I thought were temporary authorizations for tax planning. Ethan had rewritten the terms. Vanessa had slipped them in, and I had signed them, thinking they were something else. My heart sank, but my face stayed still. Ethan leaned closer. "We figured this was a better time to share it, since you love surprises. Also, Vanessa's been working so hard. She deserves to feel ownership now." Vanessa didn't look at me. She turned back to the guests and said, "My mother has done enough. She's earned her rest. We'll make sure the place runs beautifully." Then it happened. Vanessa placed a hand on my arm and spoke low, just loud enough for a few people near us to hear. "You can keep the guest room for now, but please don't touch anything in the study. We'll be reorganizing." That was it. I didn't speak. I stood up, walked out of my own vineyard, and kept walking past the rows of Cabernet vines I planted with my husband 30 years ago. I walked past the workers, past the trellis arch we built together the summer after he got sick. I walked all the way back to the house, packed a small suitcase, and left before the sun had fully set. Nobody came after me. I drove to the beach house. It was a quiet drive, nearly 5 hours down the coast. I remember watching the sky turn pale and then dark again. When I reached Carmel, the gate was closed. I entered the old code. Denied. I tried again. Denied. The locks had been changed. For a few minutes I just sat in the car with my hands on the wheel. Then I got out and walked around to the back. The house was dark, but a sensor light clicked on. A motion camera turned toward me. I knew Ethan had installed it. He had suggested cameras for safety last year, but now it felt like surveillance. The ocean was louder than usual, or maybe I was just hearing it differently. I sat on the steps, alone, with my suitcase beside me. That night, I didn't cry. Not because it didn't hurt, but because the hurt was so large, it no longer fit through tears. I stayed at a motel on the edge of town, one of those faded places where everything smells like salt and cleaning fluid. I didn't sleep. I kept replaying her voice. "You can keep the guest room. Please don't touch the study." The next morning, I went to see Grayson, and maybe this is where I pause. Because if you're still listening, you already know what's coming isn't soft. What they did wasn't some misunderstanding. It was a takeover. Cold, deliberate. And what I did next wasn't graceful. It was calculated. Because sometimes you don't get back what was taken. You build something else, sharper. And you wait for the day they taste it. Grayson opened the door before I even knocked. His office smelled the same as it had 20 years ago: cedar, old books, and black coffee. I sat in the same leather chair I used to sit in when I came here with Robert. Back then, it was about vineyard contracts, water rights, occasionally updating the will. This time, I said nothing for the first few minutes. I just looked at him, and he understood. "She did it," I said finally. Grayson didn't ask what I meant. He already knew. He reached for his reading glasses and opened his desk drawer. The papers were already prepared. The real ones. The ones we filed quietly years ago, without telling Vanessa or Ethan. A private trust agreement with my name on every page. Signatures verified. Notarized. Sealed. It was the last smart decision Robert and I ever made together. "I'm activating it," I said. He nodded. He didn't try to talk me down. He didn't ask me if I was sure. That was why I came here. Grayson was the only person left in my life who didn't second-guess me. "I want them out," I added. "Out of the vineyard. Out of the house. I want everything reversed. Legally. Publicly." Grayson said it would take 48 hours. Maybe less. After that, I drove back to the motel. The room was still cold. The same bedsheet I hadn't bothered to pull up. The suitcase still by the door. I didn't touch anything. I just sat at the small table, stared at the blank wall, and let the silence stretch. I didn't cry then either. Not because I wasn't broken, but because I didn't want to give them one more thing. Not even my tears. The next day, I visited the vineyard. I parked on the far side near the maintenance shed and walked in from the back entrance. No one saw me. I stayed in the shadows, watched the movement of workers. I saw Miguel near the trellises, still loyal, still working like the soil meant something. Then I saw Vanessa. She was giving instructions to a group of new interns, wearing one of my old sun hats like it belonged to her, pointing at rows of vines as if she'd pruned them herself. She had no idea I was watching. The sight of her made my hands shake. I left before anyone noticed, not because I was afraid, because I didn't want to do it like that. Not quietly, not behind her back. That evening I drove to Carmel again. I waited until after dark, then walked around the side gate. It was locked now with a new code, but I knew the fence line. There was always a soft spot behind the hydrangeas, where the post leaned just enough for someone determined to squeeze through. I sat on the back steps again, same as I had 2 nights before. The porch light flicked on. This time, I didn't move. The back door opened. It wasn't Vanessa. It was Emma. She froze when she saw me. Then she stepped outside slowly, shut the door behind her, and sat down next to me. "They're not home," she whispered. I nodded. Emma didn't ask why I was there. She looked down at my hands, still resting on my knees, and noticed the folded piece of paper in my palm. I handed it to her. It was a note Robert had written to me on our 35th anniversary. Just one sentence scribbled on vineyard letterhead. "You are the soil this family grew from." Emma read it. She didn't say anything, just held it like it was glass. I used to think silence was weakness. But sitting next to her that night, I realized silence could also be power. Before I left, Emma stood and ran inside. She came back with something in her hand. It was Robert's old notebook, the one he kept for sketches and property notes. I thought I had lost it years ago. She had found it in the bottom drawer of the study, hidden behind tax records. I took it with both hands. That notebook meant more to me than any of the title papers Vanessa had forged. The next morning, I made calls. I spoke to Helen first. She was hesitant at first, but I told her everything. The fake signing, the takeover, being locked out of my own house. She listened in silence. Then she said she would take care of the rest. By noon, she had sent word to the Chamber of Commerce, to the Wine Festival Committee, and to the local newspaper. If Vanessa wanted to humiliate me in public, then she would receive her answer in public too. I wasn't hiding anymore. 2 days later, the invitations went out. Special screening, festival presentation, big screen under the stars. I booked the venue myself. Vanessa didn't know yet, but she would. And this time, everyone would be watching. The morning of the festival came quietly, the way big days often do. The weather was steady. The sky was overcast but dry. The town moved at its usual weekend rhythm, unaware of what had been set in motion. I had my coffee alone in the motel room, the same place I had spent the last few days. I laid out the clothes I would wear, simple, black, neat. No makeup, no jewelry. I wasn't dressing for celebration. I was dressing for reckoning. By noon, the festival grounds had started filling. The setup team arranged folding chairs in long, curved rows across the Central Plaza lawn. The wine booths lined the edges, local vendors offering tastings, homemade biscotti, and apricot preserves. A white screen had been strung between two poles in the center. By 5, the whole town would be gathered. Vanessa had no clue. Helen had handled the invitation phrasing carefully. It read, "A special visual presentation honoring 30 years of the Whitmore legacy." It was the kind of title Vanessa wouldn't question. She would assume it was about her, and that was the point. Miguel met me near the back of the setup area, just beyond the chairs. He gave a small nod, quiet and tight. He had brought the final documents I requested, a copy of the vineyard operating history, the labor reports, the water rights ledger, all in my name, all untouched. He had also found the scanned copy of the sale negotiation draft that Ethan had started with the foreign buyers. Miguel hadn't said much when I explained what I planned to do. He just asked what time he should be there. By 3, the Whitmore family booth was the most crowded. Vanessa stood beside Ethan, wearing a cream-colored dress and gold pendant. She smiled and posed for pictures beside bottles of wine she didn't blend and posters of harvests she never worked. Ethan circled the tables, shaking hands, talking about future plans, foreign markets, partnership expansions. They were proud of themselves, and completely unaware that their celebration was being rearranged in real time. I stayed in the background until the sun started falling. I didn't need to be seen yet. Grayson arrived just before 6. He wore a navy suit and carried a black portfolio. He stood at the edge of the plaza, just out of Vanessa's line of sight. I nodded at him. He nodded back. When the first notes of acoustic guitar played, signaling the start of the official program, I stepped forward. Helen took the stage first. She welcomed the guests, thanked the sponsors, and introduced what she called a short film commemorating Francis Whitmore's original vision. Vanessa tilted her head. I saw it. She whispered something to Ethan. Then the screen lit up. The footage began with images of the vineyard from the early years, old film photos, Robert and I standing beside the young vines, our dog Lucy running through the rows, a few shots of our first tasting room, back when it was a garage. My voice was layered underneath, from an old interview with the local paper. I talked about why we built it, what we wanted it to stand for. Legacy, integrity, belonging. The crowd watched in silence, then the tone shifted. The footage cut to screenshots of internal emails, Ethan's email to the investment firm in Bordeaux, the offer letter from the Singapore buyers, the draft outlining the sale of all vineyard assets, including the beach house, for 11.8 million. Ethan's signature, Vanessa's approval, both dated 3 days before the family celebration. People began murmuring, some leaned forward, others turned to glance at Vanessa, but the screen wasn't done. It shifted again. This time, video, security footage. Ethan and Vanessa sitting in my study, rifling through old tax records, pulling out deed copies, scanning files. Ethan holding up a paper and saying, "If we can get her to sign this version, it's done." Vanessa replying, "She never reads the fine print. She trusts me." Gasps rose from the crowd. I heard one woman whisper, "Oh my God." A man stood up, crossed his arms. Several phones came out. Vanessa was frozen. Ethan reached for her elbow. She pulled away. Then I stepped forward. I didn't speak through a microphone. I didn't raise my voice. I stood in front of the screen and said what needed to be said. Everything you just saw is real. Every signature, every plan, every lie. Vanessa tried to say something, but people weren't listening to her anymore. This land was never for sale, not to investors, not to children who see their mother as a stepping stone. I pulled a single sheet from my coat pocket. Grayson stepped forward and handed me the rest. I held them in front of me. This is the legal trust, dated, sealed, executed years ago. It overrides every document they forged, every title they claimed. Silence fell. No one moved. I turned and handed the documents to the local notary, who stepped out from the side tent. Grayson cleared his throat. "We've also filed a complaint with the district attorney. Fraud, elder abuse, unauthorized transfer of protected property. Law enforcement will follow up." Vanessa stepped back. Ethan started to argue, but Helen walked straight to the microphone. I watched Frances get locked out of her own house. I saw her work wiped from every bottle label. That isn't misunderstanding. That is theft. And you applauded it. The crowd started shifting. People backed away from Vanessa's booth. One vendor quietly began packing his table. I saw one of the festival organizers make a call, and then it happened. 2 officers approached from the west path. They didn't say a word. Ethan raised his voice. One of them showed him the papers. They escorted him away. Vanessa stared after him, hollow-eyed, her mouth open, but no words came out. I didn't look at her. I stepped off the stage, walked toward the back row, and didn't stop. I didn't need to be the center of that moment. I had already won. The festival lawn was nearly full by late afternoon. Folding chairs stretched across the plaza in long, curved rows, catching the early evening light. There was a soft hum in the air, laughter, small talk, the clink of wine glasses. Booths lined the perimeter, banners fluttering above them, each one shouting something about heritage, flavor, or family. It would have been beautiful if I didn't know what it was covering up. I stood behind the canvas wall of the sponsor tent. Miguel was there with me, standing quietly, his arms folded, eyes fixed on the crowd. He'd been loyal to the vineyard longer than Vanessa had lived in it. On the small wooden table in front of us sat a laptop and a slim silver projector. Grayson had loaded the files earlier that morning, checked the connection, tested the sound. Everything was ready. From where we stood, I could see Vanessa. She was in full performance mode, hand on hip, head tilted, guiding a photographer toward a better angle. Ethan stood nearby, talking with a man in a blazer and Italian shoes. Probably someone from the Bordeaux group. Ethan had that tone he always used when he was trying to sell something. Vanessa wore a burgundy wrap dress and gold earrings. She looked polished, in control, a woman proud of the empire she believed she had inherited. She still had no idea. Grayson arrived exactly at 6. He didn't say a word. Just gave me the same nod he always gave when it was time to begin. I walked to the back of the tech platform while he moved toward the MC to cue the start of the presentation. That's what it had been called in the program. Nothing suspicious, just a presentation. Helen stepped up to the microphone. Her voice rang clear across the lawn. Ladies and gentlemen, as part of our celebration tonight, we'd like to share a short film honoring the legacy of the Whitmore Vineyard. A story of roots, of resilience, and of what it means to build something that lasts. The lights dimmed slightly, the projector flickered, and then the screen lit up. The opening sequence was warm, black and white photos of the vineyard during its earliest years. Robert and I digging trenches by hand, the first saplings. The original bottling room, barely more than a garage. My voice played over the top, an audio clip from an old radio interview. I spoke about hard choices, drought seasons, and the stubbornness it took to protect land you love. People smiled, some nodded. Vanessa crossed her arms. Then the footage changed. An email appeared on the screen, Ethan's name in bold at the top. The recipient, a Singapore investment group. Subject line, acquisition proposal. The date was 2 weeks before the family event. The body of the message detailed the terms of sale, vineyard assets, property parcels, even the beach house. Total value, $11.8 million. Another email followed. Vanessa's reply. She approved the terms. She called the plan efficient. She confirmed I had signed the paperwork, that they now controlled the title. A few people in the crowd started whispering. Then the screen cut to a video. Security footage. Ethan and Vanessa in my study, rifling through files, printing copies. At one point, Ethan held up a paper and said, "This one is perfect. She won't know the difference." Vanessa laughed in the recording, the same laugh she used when she got away with something. The sound of that laugh on the speakers made my stomach turn, but I stood still. The camera panned to the crowd. Faces had changed. Some looked uncomfortable, others angry. A man from the Historical Society shook his head and walked away. I saw one of the wine judges put down his glass and leave the tasting table. Vanessa froze. Ethan was no longer near her. Helen stepped forward again. Sometimes a family's legacy doesn't belong to just one person. Sometimes it belongs to the truth. And tonight, the truth is no longer silent. She stepped aside. Grayson took her place at the microphone. "I'm here as legal counsel for Frances Whitmore. The trust agreement filed by her, in partnership with her late husband, remains active and supersedes any unauthorized transfer. Documents provided by Ethan and Vanessa Whitmore were forged, and a formal investigation is now underway for attempted fraud and property misrepresentation." He held up a folder as the screen behind him showed scanned copies of the official trust documents. My name, Robert's name, the date, the seal, the notary. The effect was immediate. Several guests moved away from Vanessa. A couple backed away entirely from the booth. I heard someone mutter a curse. Another woman called her a disgrace. Vanessa turned to leave, but 2 officers were already approaching. Quiet, calm, methodical. They asked her to remain in place. Ethan had already disappeared from the main area. They found him near the staff tents, phone in hand, trying to call someone. He didn't resist. He looked smaller than usual. Neither one of them looked back at me. I didn't move. I waited until the screen turned black, until the sound faded, until the crowd began to scatter, voices rising, opinions flying. Only then did I step forward, past the stage, past the chairs. Miguel caught up to me near the parking lot. He didn't say anything. He just handed me something. A cork from one of our early reserve bottles. The label had faded, but I remembered the date, the year we first made a profit. I closed my hand around it. I got in my truck and drove home. Not the motel, not the beach house. Home. The vineyard gate opened on cue. The house lights were off, but everything felt exactly as it should. The floors still creaked the same way. The air still smelled faintly of cedar and lavender. I set the cork on the mantel and sat down in Robert's old armchair. I didn't turn on the lights. I didn't need to. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't trying to prove anything. I wasn't defending my place or my name or my blood. I had nothing to reclaim, because I had never really lost it. I slept for 12 straight hours after the festival. No alarms, no anxious twisting in bed. My body had finally given in, like it had been waiting for the storm to break before letting go. When I woke, it was still quiet. The vineyard was hushed, as if it too needed time to breathe. The first thing I did was walk the property. No one was there, not even the grounds crew. The air was damp, the sky soft grey, the kind that made the vines seem almost silver. I moved slow, steady, past the irrigation rows and down toward the boundary line where Robert and I once planted wild lavender just for the bees. The plants were still there, overgrown now, but blooming. I stopped for a long while in front of them. By noon, the messages started. The first was from Helen. Just a simple line. You did what needed to be done. Then Grayson. He informed me the legal freeze was now in full effect. Vanessa and Ethan could not access any financial assets tied to the vineyard or the beach house. He said the DA had already received the compiled reports and would move forward with questioning. But I didn't feel triumphant. Not yet. Victory wasn't what I was after. It was quiet. And quiet was what I needed. Around 3 in the afternoon, Miguel came by with 2 workers. They wanted to know if I was comfortable with them finishing the current bottling batch under my name. I said yes. It was more than yes. It was relief. I watched them walk the perimeter, Miguel giving instructions like he always had. The vineyard had survived. It would continue. But I knew what came next would not be about the vines. It would be about the people. That night, I received a knock at the front gate. It was Emma. She stood there holding a bag of groceries and an envelope. She didn't say much, just handed them to me. I let her inside, made her tea, let her sit quietly while I prepped the vegetables she brought. We didn't talk about her parents. She looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. Before she left, she handed me the envelope. I waited until she was out of sight before opening it. Inside was a letter from Vanessa, 3 pages, handwritten. I read it once, slowly, then again, faster. There were no apologies, only explanations, sentences about pressure, about not being seen, about wanting something for herself. The closest she came to remorse was a line near the end. I didn't think you'd fight back like that. I folded the letter in half and put it in the drawer next to the stove. I didn't feel anger. I felt distance, like she was someone I had once known, or once imagined I would raise, but not the woman who now existed. A week passed. Vanessa didn't contact me again. Ethan stayed quiet too. Helen told me he had packed a storage unit with some of his belongings, likely preparing for the long road ahead with legal proceedings. Grayson said they were already trying to settle through back channels, but I told him no. I didn't want money. I didn't want silence. I wanted them to face it. And then one morning, Vanessa showed up. She didn't text, didn't call, just drove up to the gate in the same car she had driven since college. She waited. I almost didn't open it, but I did. She stepped out, hair pulled back, no makeup, nothing polished. She looked older, smaller. She didn't ask to come in, just stood there, clutching a folder to her chest. I told her we would talk out by the vineyard. I didn't want her inside the house, not yet. We walked side by side through the southern rows. The grapes weren't full yet, but the leaves had begun to stretch open, green and soft against the sun. It was the same path she used to run through barefoot when she was 8. She started speaking before I could say anything. She said she had been ashamed, that the festival broke something in her, that seeing the footage made her realize what she had become, that Ethan had driven a wedge, but she let him, that she did more damage than she could fix. I didn't interrupt. She finally said the word she hadn't written in her letter. Sorry, it didn't fix anything, but I heard it. She reached into the folder and pulled out a form. It was a notarized declaration. She was withdrawing from any claim to the vineyard and the Carmel property. Grayson already had control of the assets, but this was symbolic. A statement, in writing, from her, saying she no longer wanted it, that she didn't deserve it. I asked her what she wanted from me. She looked down, hesitated, and said she wanted Emma to have a relationship with her grandmother. That's all. I told her the gate would stay closed for now, but the vineyard would always be there. And I would be too. She nodded. No tears, no hugging. Just a silence that sat between us like a field too wide to cross all at once. She turned and walked back toward her car. I stayed out in the rows a while longer. The quiet felt different now, less like a wound, more like the start of something clean. I wasn't ready to forgive, but I was ready to stop holding the weight alone. And maybe that was enough. 3 days passed after Vanessa's visit. The morning after, I walked out to the porch with my coffee and stood barefoot on the wooden boards, letting the cool air wrap around my ankles. It was the kind of quiet that didn't press down on you but allowed space to breathe. I hadn't realized how much I needed space until it came back. I spent those days without a schedule. No meetings, no calls, no requests for signatures. Miguel kept the vineyard running with his usual rhythm. He'd text short updates when needed, but mostly he left me to my peace. I stayed out of the office and off the bottling floor. I let the land move without me for the first time in years. In the evenings, I read from Robert's old notebooks, his sketches of irrigation patterns, his notes about barrel rotations, even his scribbles about compost mixtures. There were pages where he'd written random thoughts that had nothing to do with the vineyard. Just memories, bits of stories, observations about birds nesting in the gutters. Reading them felt like sitting beside him again. He had always made room for the small things. I had spent too many years carrying only the heavy ones. On the 4th morning, Grayson called. He said the formal investigation had reached a turning point. Ethan had been charged with multiple counts of financial fraud. Vanessa, though not named in the primary documents, was included as a secondary witness. The prosecution had offered her a deal: testify fully, with supporting documents, and avoid additional charges. Grayson asked if I wanted to be involved. I said no. That part was finished for me. I didn't need to watch them explain themselves in court. I didn't need to hear their reasons turned into strategy. The law would do its work. My part had been reclaiming what was mine and making sure the damage didn't go unseen. I had done that. Now I wanted to repair what was still standing. That afternoon, I went down to the old tool shed beside the south fence. It had been Robert's little workspace for years. The door stuck like always, and the air inside smelled like rust and pine. I found the chalkboard we used to keep harvest notes on and wiped it clean. Then I picked up the piece of white chalk that had been sitting in the corner tray for a decade. I wrote 2 names, Emma Whitmore, Frances Whitmore. Just names, no dates, no titles. It wasn't about who owned what. It was about who stayed. That night I cooked dinner for the first time since the festival. Just pasta with garlic and tomatoes, but I took my time. I lit a candle, even though I was eating alone. I let the sauce simmer longer than needed. I played music in the background, one of Robert's favorite jazz records. The house didn't feel haunted anymore. The next morning, Emma showed up again. She didn't knock, just waited by the porch until I opened the door. She carried a sketch pad this time, a little beat-up thing covered in stickers. She said she had been drawing the vineyard. I offered her lemonade, and she followed me to the back table. She didn't speak much at first, just flipped through the pages, showing me tiny rows of vines, a sketch of the beach house from memory, a rough outline of the bottling shed. Then she pulled out a folded piece of paper from her backpack. It was a printed application for a student art scholarship in Sonoma County. She wanted to apply but needed a portfolio review and a parent or guardian signature. I signed it without asking questions. Later that day, we walked the vineyard together. I showed her how to spot the signs of early mildew. She asked about pruning techniques, about the history of the trellis design, about the split in soil texture near the northern slope. She listened like it mattered, not for profit, not for performance, but because the land had something to teach her. She had her mother's eyes, but she also had her grandfather's patience. When the sun started dropping, we sat under the walnut tree by the lower property line. It was a place no one ever bothered with, but Robert used to say it had the best view of the valley. Emma pulled out her sketch pad again and began to draw. I didn't watch her. I watched the light stretch across the field, long and low, like it was trying to touch everything one last time before night came. Something shifted in me then. Not forgiveness, not forgetting, but release. The need to prove anything was gone. The ache to be understood had softened. I didn't need Vanessa to make things right anymore. I just needed to make space for what could still grow. That evening, I cleared the study. I packed away old folders, cleared the shelves, wiped the dust from the windows. I left Robert's chair where it had always been, but moved my own across from it. For the first time, I wanted the room to feel open, not crowded by what used to be. On the desk, I placed the chalkboard. The names were still there, not erased, not rewritten, just there, quiet and firm, the way roots stay in the soil long after the harvest. The following week moved slow, the kind of slow that doesn't drag but steadies everything. The mornings were cooler, the vineyard breathed easier. Miguel reported a healthy bloom across the western vines, and the crew said the soil had taken well to the changes we made in spring. I let the work happen without hovering. I kept to the margins. Most days I stayed near the house or took long walks around the property line. I wasn't hiding. I just didn't feel like being asked how I was holding up. I didn't need that kind of attention. What I needed was quiet structure, something predictable, something mine. On Thursday, Grayson dropped by. He didn't come inside. He stood on the porch, handed me a sealed envelope, and said it was only for my records. No signatures needed. He told me the county had closed the investigation. No trial, no press. Ethan had entered a plea, financial penalties, community service, and a 5-year professional restriction. Vanessa had complied with every request from the DA, no charges filed against her, nothing left to pursue. I thanked him, then placed the envelope in the drawer beside Robert's notebooks. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. I sat on the porch long after Grayson's car disappeared down the drive. The sun was steady overhead, and the breeze was light. Everything looked normal. Everything looked fine. But there was a dull thud inside me, something I couldn't quite name. I had won. The vineyard was safe. The house was mine. The land was protected. The people who tried to erase me had failed. And yet it didn't feel like a story wrapped in ribbon. It felt unfinished. That evening, I went down to the cellar. Not the wine cellar, the root cellar. The one behind the house that Robert and I had used for canned vegetables, preserves, extra supplies. It had been cleaned out years ago, but we never filled it back up. I hadn't gone down there in a long time. The door creaked like it always had. The air inside was damp, a little musty, but not unpleasant. It smelled like earth, like something that didn't care about time. I brought down a small box with me. Inside were old photographs, family trips, birthdays, newspaper clippings from when the vineyard first won awards, letters from Robert's mother, drawings Vanessa made when she was 5. I sat on the wooden bench in the corner and began sorting, not to archive, not to organize, just to see what had survived. There were pictures of Vanessa as a child, muddy-faced and smiling in the garden, one of her curled up beside Robert on the living room rug, both asleep. Another from her high school graduation, eyes bright, hands clenched tight around her diploma. That photo stayed in my hand a while. I wasn't trying to forgive her. I wasn't trying to rebuild what had broken. I just wanted to remember the parts of her that had once been tender, before the weight of her own ambition turned everything sharp. Upstairs, I heard the front door open. Emma had her own key now. She knew not to call out. She knew I'd find her when I was ready. I climbed the steps slowly and met her in the kitchen. She had brought figs and goat cheese from the farm stand, a loaf of bread still warm from baking. We made sandwiches without talking much. She told me about school. Her art teacher had pulled her aside to ask if she would submit to the student gallery. She hadn't decided yet. I told her it was her choice, that no one needed to tell her what to do with her talent. She smiled and said she knew that already, but she liked hearing it anyway. After dinner, she asked if we could walk the northern slope. We hadn't gone that way in a while. The light there always fell differently in the evening, slanted and honey-coloured. We walked in silence at first. Then Emma asked if I remembered the row of plum trees near the old irrigation shed. I said yes. She asked if we could plant more. I said maybe. The path wound higher, and we reached the ridge where the vines stopped and the open field began. It had never been cultivated. The soil there wasn't good for grapes. But Robert used to talk about building a small house there someday. Just one story. Wooden. Nothing grand. A place to sit with the morning sun and hear the birds wake. I told Emma the story. She asked if I ever wanted to build it. I said I didn't know. She said maybe I should. Then she asked if her mother used to like this spot. I paused. I said yes. She used to come here with her sketch pad. She used to say the light made everything look softer. She used to say it felt like a pause button. Emma nodded. We sat on the ridge until the wind picked up. Back at the house, she helped me carry a box up from the root cellar. It was filled with the old photographs I had chosen to keep. She didn't ask who was in each picture. She just helped me slide them into sleeves, press them into an album, one page at a time. Later, I watched her sleep on the sofa with a blanket pulled to her chin, the photo album still resting beside her arm. I didn't feel like something had ended. I didn't feel like something had begun. But I did feel anchored. And for now, that was more than enough. 2 weeks later, I received a letter that wasn't meant for me. It was addressed to the vineyard office, but Miguel handed it to me directly. It came from a publisher in San Francisco. A glossy envelope with the return logo of a wine lifestyle magazine printed in silver along the corner. Inside was a handwritten note, clipped to a draft. Vanessa had submitted an essay. Not a story, not a column, not an article with polished quotes or a promotional headline. An essay. Personal, raw, typed but uneven, with certain lines struck through and rewritten in pen. The title read, "The Year I Nearly Lost the Soil Beneath My Feet." I didn't read it right away. I put it on the kitchen table, made coffee, cleaned the sink, watered the back porch succulents. I walked the driveway and stood in the shade of the walnut tree. I waited until I felt something settle before I sat down and opened the pages. It was not a confession. It was not an apology. but it was honest. She wrote about legacy, about pressure, about the myth of deserving things simply because you were born near them. She wrote about being raised with love and not knowing how to give it back when it counted. She wrote about watching her mother walk away without screaming. She wrote about being raised by a vineyard and still missing the point. I finished it in one sitting, folded the pages again, put them back in the envelope, and slid it into a drawer next to her childhood drawings. That same afternoon, I returned to the ridge where Emma and I had sat weeks earlier. The air smelled of clover and early heat. Spring had pushed itself fully into the hills. The grass had gone thick. A few wildflowers stubbornly bloomed despite the rocky ground. I stood at the top and looked out over everything that had been touched and retouched over the decades, not just by hands, but by time, by decisions, by the absence of people who once stood there. Robert's vision for the ridge came back to me. The single-story house, the morning sun, the view. I walked the boundary with my hand brushing the fence post, counting each step, memorizing the rise and fall of the land. Then I returned to the main house, found the old survey maps, and pulled out a pen. That evening, I called Grayson. The next day, we sat on the porch and reviewed the preliminary paperwork. He adjusted his glasses, asked me once if I was sure. I nodded. He didn't question it again. He understood that this wasn't about reclaiming space. This was about planting something future-facing. I had decided to build it, the house on the ridge, but not for me. For women like me, the ones who were talked over, signed out of documents, labeled difficult or dramatic or disposable, the ones who gave up parts of themselves for families that forgot to ask what they ever wanted in return. The structure would be simple. 2 rooms, one for living, one for reflection. A wraparound porch, nothing ornamental, just strong, quiet, set with intention. A place for older women rebuilding, for women restarting, for women who had been erased and needed somewhere with walls and windows and air that did not require permission. I called it the Ridge House. Construction would start by summer. We would use local builders, local materials, no rush, no ribbon cutting. The next week, Emma and I stood on the ridge again, this time with orange flags stuck into the soil where the outer corners would rest. She walked the rectangle with care, eyes tracing the lines of what didn't yet exist. I told her it was hers as much as mine. She didn't speak. She just nodded, took one of the flags, and placed it deeper into the earth. Miguel offered to plant new trees nearby, walnut and plum. He said they would grow slowly, but they would last. That weekend, I received a second letter. Not from Vanessa, not from the DA, not from the magazine. It was from a woman named Lorraine, sent from a town I hadn't visited in decades. She had read about the festival online. Someone had shared a recording. She saw my name. She remembered a letter I had written years ago to a local women's group, back when I was trying to raise funds for irrigation repairs. She remembered my name because she had copied my words once to give herself courage. Now she wanted to give back. She had recently lost her own family land to a dishonest partner. She had nowhere to go, no place to feel safe, no silence that belonged to her. She asked if I knew of any programs for women like her. I wrote her back with the blueprint for the Ridge House. I told her we were not ready yet, but that we were building. I told her the foundation would be poured in July. I told her there would be a room for her if she needed one. She replied 3 days later. She said yes. And just like that, something new took root. Not a revival of what was, not a restoration of what had been, but something forward. And this time, it would grow from women who knew exactly what it meant to lose everything and still choose to plant again. Framing for the Ridge House began 2 weeks after Lorraine's letter. Miguel brought in a crew from Calistoga, all local. all people who knew how to work with quiet ground, the kind of builders who measured twice, spoke only when needed, and understood that this was more than a project. It wasn't a retirement home. It wasn't a guest cabin. It wasn't a shelter. It was a statement. We cleared the topsoil gently. We saved the roots where we could. I walked the site every morning before they arrived and again after they left. I wanted to be present for every inch. I wanted the foundation to feel like part of me. Lorraine arrived just as the subfloor was going in. She came with 2 bags and a worn satchel filled with notebooks. She had a voice that was softer than I expected. She walked slowly, looked people in the eye, and didn't smile unless it was real. I picked her up from the bus stop in town and said we'd take the long way back to the vineyard. She didn't ask for explanations. She just rode quietly, taking in the fields and the curve of the road like someone trying to remember the world again. That night, I made stew and set the table for 2. Emma joined us later. The 3 of us ate in calm silence. No music, no news, just the rhythm of spoons against bowls and the occasional clink of water glasses. When the meal was done, Lorraine helped with dishes without being asked. She dried every plate as if she were polishing something sacred. By the end of the week, she had begun organizing the shed beside the ridge. She cleaned out old tools, labeled supplies, swept the floors, and rearranged the workbench. She didn't say much while she worked. She didn't need to. The act itself was a language. It was care without ceremony, structure without noise. Emma started joining her in the afternoons. They didn't talk much. Emma drew. Lorraine sanded down an old bench someone had left years ago. They moved beside each other without friction. Like people who understood space was a gift you give, not something you fill. I met with Grayson that Friday to finalize the formal foundation paperwork. He suggested we draft a statement of purpose, something that could define what the Ridge House stood for. I told him I'd think about it. I wasn't interested in mission statements. I was interested in rooms that didn't require explanations. But later that night, I found myself writing one anyway. Not for the county, not for donors, just for me. The Ridge House exists for women who have been cut out of photographs, signatures, and conversations. For those who have been talked over, passed down, or written off. For those who chose not to shout, but still deserve to be heard. It is not a reward. It is not a rescue. It is a return. I taped it to the inside of the cabinet above the sink, where no one else needed to see it, where I could reach for a mug each morning and remember. A few days later, a truck from the lumberyard arrived. The driver handed me a clipboard and asked if I was Mrs. Whitmore. I said yes, though I hadn't heard that name spoken by a stranger in years. He smiled, nodded toward the back, and said the special order redwood panels had arrived early. He said someone had paid for them in full already. The receipt listed the name Emma Whitmore. I waited until she came home from school to ask about it. She shrugged, said she used the money from her first commission. A gallery owner had seen her sketches online and offered to buy 3. She had wanted to buy a phone. Instead, she bought siding. She said it felt better that way. The next week, I stood with Miguel as they began raising the frame. I held my breath as the first beams went up. It didn't feel ceremonial, it felt right. A frame of something steady in a life that had moved too often without my permission. Vanessa hadn't contacted me since the letter from the magazine. I hadn't reached out either. Grayson said she was still cooperating with the Financial Review Board. She had submitted statements, copies of bank records, and a written timeline of events. She hadn't hired a lawyer. She hadn't tried to appeal anything. But that wasn't what stayed with me. What stayed with me was what Grayson said next. She withdrew her claim to the vineyard entirely, signed and filed. No press, no letters, no instructions. Just a quiet line drawn and a door shut behind her. It didn't bring comfort. It brought clarity. She had taken what she wanted. Then she tried to take what was not hers, and when she lost, she stepped back. That was all. Lorraine stayed on, not permanently, but longer than she expected. She began planting herbs in the soil behind the shed: lavender, mint, sage. She said she liked the way they held their shape. Emma helped her build a trellis. They painted it sea green. The wind came early that spring, stronger than usual. It knocked loose some of the west fencing. Miguel and I fixed it together one morning before breakfast. As we worked, he told me he had spoken to his sister. She wanted to volunteer at the Ridge House when it opened. Said it reminded her of a place their grandmother once ran. A kitchen table with chairs that matched nothing but made everyone feel like they belonged. I liked that. One afternoon, I found Lorraine sitting on the porch steps beside the nearly finished frame. She was reading a book with a cracked spine and a faded blue cover. She didn't look up when I joined her. She just turned a page and said she had never felt time slow down like this before. She said most places made her feel like she was behind. This place made her feel like she was right on time. I didn't say anything. I just sat beside her, feeling the air stretch around us. Not waiting for anything, not recovering from anything. Just there, as it was meant to be. The Ridge House stood quiet and unfinished, but it had already become something people moved toward. It wasn't open. No signs, no announcements. Still, every few days, someone new walked the vineyard fence line and paused just long enough to be noticed. Some were neighbors, some were strangers, women mostly. A few stopped to ask Miguel about the building. Some kept their distance, just stood for a few minutes, then walked away. But the shape of the structure, even bare-boned as it was, pulled people in. It had presence. It carried weight. The kind of weight that doesn't push down, but holds things up. We were 2 weeks from closing in the walls when the letter from Vanessa arrived. It came in a plain envelope with no return address, postmarked locally, folded into thirds, 1 page, brief, not careless, but intentional. She had written that she was leaving California. There was no mention of where she was going, no details about what she planned to do, just a few sentences. She said she had found part-time work at a winery in Oregon, far from cities and headlines. She didn't ask for anything. Not forgiveness, not connection, not even understanding. But she wrote one line that stayed with me. I won't use your name again. Not because I don't carry it, but because I didn't earn it. I read it once, then placed it in the drawer under the Ridge House ledger. The next morning I walked the perimeter of the new build and took inventory of every nail left out, every board that needed cutting. Miguel and I chalked the lines for the final joists. He said the window shipments were delayed, but the frame would hold through weather. That night, it rained. A soft, even rain. The kind that wakes you, not because it's loud, but because the rhythm of it seeps into the house. I made tea, sat at the kitchen table, and listened to it press against the glass. Emma came down an hour later with her sketch pad under her arm. She didn't say anything. She just sat at the table across from me and began drawing. I watched the steam from our mugs curl upward and vanish. When the sun rose, the air smelled like wet cedar and cooled ash. The trees dripped slow. The soil darkened. The Ridge House stood still. It hadn't bent. The boards had held. Miguel's crew arrived at 7 sharp and began work without comment. They had the roof lined by dusk. By the end of the week, Lorraine moved her things from the main house to the temporary room we had set up behind the Ridge House frame. A cot, a lamp, a shelf of worn books. She wanted to be closer, not to oversee, just to witness. She said she didn't want to miss the first night when the door finally closed against the wind. On Friday, I received a call from Helen. She had spoken with the local women's collective. They were interested in partnering with the Ridge House. Not officially, not with grants or meetings, just women showing up, offering skills, time, knowledge. One was a gardener. One knew plumbing. One ran a food pantry and said she could spare supplies. They didn't want thanks. They wanted to help because they knew the shape of silence. I said yes. That weekend, we held our first workday. No ceremony, no camera crews. Just 10 women with gloves and tools, digging, lifting, sanding, planting. We planted rosemary and marjoram along the walkway. We laid stones from the riverbed behind the vineyard as edging. Emma painted the doorframe a muted green. Lorraine hung wind chimes made of broken utensils and bottle glass. By sundown, the place looked touched. Not finished, not polished, but held. Emma asked to sleep in the Ridge house that night, just for one night. I told her yes. Lorraine stayed with her, just in case the wind came back strong. I watched from the main house as the light flickered through the unfinished windows. I didn't sleep much, not from worry, from something else. A current inside me that hadn't found rest yet. Around midnight, I walked out to the Ridge house alone. The grass was wet, and the sky was too clear. I stood by the front steps and listened. No sounds, just breath. I didn't knock. I didn't go in. I just stood there. Long enough to know that this was not a project. This was a boundary between what had tried to erase me and what I had built anyway. At sunrise, the crew returned. Lorraine made coffee for everyone. Miguel handed me the final checklist. We had a week left before the inside would be ready. Paint, fixtures, a few last-minute adjustments to the plumbing. Nothing urgent, nothing impossible. That afternoon, Helen dropped off a small stack of cards. Handwritten. Messages from women in the valley who had seen the Ridge house from the road. Some left only initials, others left stories, not long ones, just enough to say, "I've been there too." I sat at the porch with those cards for a long time. The wind didn't pick up. The air stayed still. I took one card and slipped it into the wall before the final panel closed. Just one. No signature. Just a line that read, "This is the first time I have ever been named. The Ridge house was almost ready." Miguel and I walked the interior one final time that morning. He ran his hand across the trim near the kitchen window and said it would hold through the winter. I believed him. Everything about the structure felt different than any place I had ever lived. Not because it was bigger, not because it was newer, but because it was built for no one's ego. Emma brought a rug she had dyed by hand and laid it across the main room floor, shades of dusty blue and rust. It didn't match anything, which made it perfect. Lorraine added a small ceramic bowl near the entrance filled with polished river stones. No explanations, just something grounded, something present. Grayson came by with the final documents. He carried the stack in a manila folder and placed it on the table in front of me. Inside were signatures, acknowledgements, and registrations. It was done. The Ridge house was now legally protected. It would never be sold. It could never be transferred. It existed beyond names. I asked Grayson to stay for coffee. He accepted. We sat under the tree near the vineyard fence line and spoke about nothing urgent. He told me about his daughter moving back to Mendocino. I told him about the new fig trees Miguel planted near the west slope. When he stood to leave, he paused and said this had been one of the few times he had watched something begin instead of end. The next morning, the final coat of paint went on the front door. The green was warmer than expected, softer than olive, deeper than sage. Lorraine called it the color of persistence. I let that name stay. That same day, I received a voicemail from Vanessa. She didn't ask for anything. She only said she had heard about the Ridge house through someone in town. She said she hoped it would do what I believed it could. There was a pause in the recording long enough that I thought it had ended. Then she said, "Thank you, not for the land, not for the years, but for not letting her destroy something that mattered." I didn't call back, not out of anger, out of intention. Some things do not need to be opened again. That night, Lorraine and Emma prepared a small dinner to mark the near completion of the house. Nothing formal. Roasted vegetables, cornbread, a jar of peach preserves. We ate on the floor in the main room. The lights hummed low. The silence in the room felt like breath, not absence. After the plates were cleared, Lorraine brought out a notebook. She said she had been collecting phrases over the last few weeks. Words that women had written down, left behind, or whispered into the space. She had written them by hand, one page at a time. I read a few pages. Some lines were full sentences, others were fragments. I gave more than I ever had. I never thought I would see another key handed to me. I didn't think I was worth a second place. One page held only a date. Another had no words, just a fingerprint. We placed the notebook on the windowsill and left it open to the page with the fingerprint. Lorraine said it felt like the right place to start. That night, I stepped outside before bed. The wind had finally settled, no movement across the grass, no rustle in the trees. I stood on the Ridge House porch and looked out toward the vineyard. The house glowed behind me. The main house, the one where I had lost and rebuilt, where Robert's voice still lived in the floorboards, where Emma first came to sit quietly on the edge of things, where silence turned into space. The Ridge House was not a replacement. It was a response, a way of saying I am still here, a way of saying we will not be undone. I walked back slowly. The night was dark, but I knew the path without needing light. The porch boards creaked under my feet as I stepped inside. I made tea and let the steam rise against the kitchen window. I thought about the season ahead, the vines nearing harvest, the soil still firm. There would be mistakes, there would be losses, but the shape of this new thing would not be shaken, because it had been built after the fall, because it had been shaped by hands that had already known what it meant to be erased and still choose to return. I turned out the light and sat for a long time in the dark, not thinking, not remembering, just being, exactly where I was. Harvest came early that year. The grapes turned sweeter faster than expected, and the sunlight hit the western rows with a kind of gentle urgency. Miguel called it the cleanest yield in 5 seasons. I could feel it too, not just in the weight of the clusters, but in the air, in the stillness that wasn't quiet but complete. The Ridge House opened without announcement. No speeches, no ribbon, just a door left open and a porch light turned on the first evening of the harvest moon. Lorraine swept the entryway that morning. Emma placed a single vase of rosemary near the front window. The women from the valley came in small groups, bringing what they could: books, blankets, jars of preserves, folding chairs, notes tucked into pockets. We let them in, one at a time. No one asked why they were there. No one offered backstories. The house was not a place for explanation. It was a place for arrival. By the second week, 2 women had stayed overnight. One slept without speaking. The other brought tea and washed dishes. They left quietly the next morning, leaving behind a hand-stitched pillow and a postcard of a canyon sunset. It wasn't about healing quickly. It was about not being alone while waiting to remember who you were. The main house stayed steady. The vineyard moved on without interruption. Emma's sketches grew more precise, her lines deeper. She spent afternoons walking the rows, sometimes stopping to rest her notebook against a fence post. I watched her from the kitchen window, the same window where I used to watch Vanessa years ago. The ache that once followed me in those moments had faded. What remained was softer, not forgiveness, not forgetting, just a space wide enough for quiet to stay. Lorraine began writing again. She didn't show anyone her pages, but I saw her carry the notebook each morning, sit on the back steps of the Ridge House, and begin with a new blank page. I never asked what she was writing. I didn't need to know. The fact that she was writing at all was the answer. Grayson came by once more before the first frost. He brought a tin of shortbread and a new copy of the Ridge House registration, updated with the latest language from the county. He left it on the shelf in the reading corner beside the folded quilts. Before he left, he said the structure would outlive us. I believed him. In early November, the walnut trees dropped their leaves all at once. Emma and I raked them together into wide golden piles. She buried her hands in the middle of one and laughed like she had never been expected to carry anything. That sound stayed with me longer than I expected. On the last day of the month, I sat alone on the Ridge House porch as the sun dropped behind the hills. The air was cold but not harsh. I wrapped a blanket around my shoulders and held a mug of tea close to my chest. I looked out across everything: the house, the land, the shadows. None of it felt like triumph. None of it felt like proof. It just felt earned. And there, in that quiet, I felt something release, a kind of final letting go, not of what had happened, not of what had been lost, but of the need to hold anything too tightly. I closed my eyes, and I stayed there long enough for the porch light to flicker on behind me. If you've made it to the end of this story, thank you for walking beside me. If any part of this felt familiar, if you've ever been written out, overlooked, or quietly erased, just know this: your story is still unfolding, and sometimes the most powerful chapters begin when no one's watching. Stay grounded, keep building. I'll see you next time.